After months of receiving news from around the Europe of liberal revolutions of the common people against the authoritarian governments, the news started to hit closer to home. The revolution in France, making king abdicate and proclaiming republic, was groundbreaking, not by French standards, but still. Then the revolution spilled into Swiss Confederation, where Protestants fought conservative Catholic cantons and managed to form a Swiss federal state with liberal constitution. Italian states were also in turmoil, and then the revolution, like fire, spread to German states. It was not long until the rebellious spirit was present on the streets of Berlin. On March 9th, 1848, the crowd forced their way into the city hall. Soon an improvised parliament was formed out of informal gatherings of people outside the city hall. On 13th of March, the chief of police, Julius von Minutoli, ordered his troops to re-establish order on the streets. This caused somewhat comical situation in the streets. The Riot Act from 1835 obligated the troops to read it 3 times and then give a warning signal with the drum before proceeding to use firearms. The people on the streets knew that, so what they would do, they would face the troops, make them read the Riot Act from 1835, wait for the drums and then disappear. And then they would come back later to do the same thing over and over again. There were 2 camps around the king offering advice. General von Fuel, the governor of Berlin, had a more mild approach, advising concessions to the protesters. King's younger brother, Prince William, had a more hardline approach, requesting no concessions and a brutal response. On 18th of March, a vast crowd gathered in the palace square. The king, alongside his men, took the stage on the balcony of his palace. He proclaimed the following: "The king wishes the freedom of the press to prevail. The king wishes a united parliament to be called immediately. The king wishes that the constitution of the most liberal basis should encompass all the German lands. The king wishes for Prussia to place itself on the head of this movement." After the couple of more wishes expressed by the king, the crowd started cheering. When it was all over and done, the troops surrounding the crowd were ordered to disperse them from the palace square, but in a gentle manner. However, suddenly the gunshots were heard, and that caused all hell to break loose. As it turned out later, that the weapons were discharged by accident. The first shot was caused by a grenadier's musket getting caught on the handle of his saber, and the second shot went off when a demonstrator struck a gun on a hammer. By the afternoon, the city was a war zone. Barricades being placed on the streets, infantry advancing on the barricades and getting shot at from the building's windows. It turns out maintaining grip on the city was a lot harder than what the generals originally thought. The soldiers were forced to go one by one house, often losing a lot of men in the process. In 2 days, some 300 demonstrators and 100 soldiers were laying dead. General Prittwitz, new commander-in-chief, suggested to the king to evacuate the city and then bombard it into submission. He was also supported by King's brother William. The king, however, decided for a more peaceful approach. He wrote a proclamation, promising to evacuate his troops from the city if the city returned to order. The troops were pulled out of the city the next day. The king was confronted by his younger brother, who apparently called the king a coward, and king sent him to cool off in London. Now, unprotected by the troops, the king's destiny was in the hands of his people. On the March 21st, the king rode on his horse through the city with the German flag in his hands. The king was all out on improving his public image. On 29th of March, he appointed Ludolf Kamphausen, a leading liberal, as his prime minister. Passing constitution through National Assembly seems to be more challenging than expected. First, King was unhappy, with constitution trying to limit his powers. Second, there was disagreement between richer liberals, Kamphausen being a wealthy businessman, and the working classes and their representatives. And also, conservatives were trying to maintain status quo. Unable to secure the majority in National Assembly, Kamphausen resigned on 20th of June and was replaced by his Prussian nobleman Rudolf von Auriswald. He was soon replaced by General Ernest von Puel, who was then replaced by Count Friedrich Wilhelm von Brandenburg, King's uncle. The king was losing patience, and not wanting to lose power too, he decided to take matters in his own hands. The assembly protested against the appointment of Brandenburg as the new prime minister, on which King responded by sending 13,000 troops into the capital on 27th of November and dispersing the National Assembly. The same day, Brandenburg announced the promulgation of a new constitution. So, two similar scenarios, but this time the military force worked. The key to this was mostly rural areas. The revolution was happening in urban centers for the most part, and rural areas, especially to the east of River Elbe, the king had a lot of supporters. Also, the conservatives managed to organize military clubs. Those were associations of Prussian veterans from previous wars that were staunch supporters of the king. And most important element for King's successful maneuvering through this revolution was the loyalty of army. Most of these soldiers were coming from the same socioeconomic class that they were fighting against. But after all is said and done, the Prussian Constitution of 1848 was rather popular with the majority of liberals and moderate conservatives, even though it was promulgated by the crown and not parliament. But for the first time in Prussian history, Prussia was given a constitution, reforming her from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy.